Sheila Page, ODI. One follow-up on the question about the UK's role, but also one on that I was intending to ask. Is it actually credible that the UK will be doing anything interesting on rules of origin, innovations, anything else, given the huge agenda which it's going to have just disentangling itself? I hope Razak is right, but I doubt it. My question is really what the impact of not having the UK in the room is going to be on EU trade and aid and migration and refugee policy, on the direction of aid, because it weakens the Western versus Eastern European axis, on the composition of aid, on the allocation to LDCs, on tied aid, on trade policy. Again, the UK may or may not have a good agricultural policy, but the CAP will be reformed in its next round without the UK. What will be the impact of all of these be?
Thank you. One question right here.
Thank you all. Even though what you have listed makes me less hopeful and it looks like a catalogue of losses one after another. I work with Save the Children. I'm based in Melbourne in Australia. I voted here to stay. My question is, there was a reference to about 2 billion. Yeah, sorry, in the paper it says 1.9 billion, possibly it would have crossed to 2 billion by now, in the total value of aid that will be going into these countries. If we're talking about 700 million people who will go to bed hungry tonight, millions of children who are left out. My question is not about them. My question is, this aid also brings a lot of goodwill and soft power for UK. What's your qualitative estimate about what UK will lose out from that soft power which always aid has brought into this country, its influence and its power?
Okay, I'll take one more question in this round. Just second row.
Thanks, Stephen Guild from the ODI. Expanding in a way on both of these first two questions, there's been very little discussion tonight, and I think generally in the coverage of the vote about the impact on the EU itself as an institution. Because I think that if Britain does leave, and even if it doesn't, the EU's sort of foundations and foundational ideas have been shaken. And it seems to me that that in itself will have an impact on developing countries, both because the EU itself plays an important role, but also because I think the EU has been a very important example of successful regional cooperation, which we all encourage as a good thing for developing countries. And that will be significantly weakened. And then the second point that I'd just like to raise is about the transaction costs that developing country officials and politicians will face if they have to renegotiate or negotiate new deals with with the UK and perhaps with other countries as well. That is going to put a great burden on these countries where the skills to deal with trade issues are quite limited.
Okay, let's start with that. I mean, really, there are two questions from slightly different angles on the. What does this mean for the Europe? Both for the European Union and for the role of the EU in cooperation. Maybe Vicky, if you want to kick off.
The first thing, of course, to say is that everyone was talking about two scenarios about Europe. Either that this makes them stronger if we leave because they will try and make sure it survives and therefore they will integrate a lot more, or that this is a process of a breakup. But interestingly, although the belief in EU institutions has collapsed, soon after the Brexit vote, it's my understanding that new opinion polls which have been conducted in the various countries actually show that the desire to stay in the EU has increased very significantly in those countries because they've seen the mess, or at least they're perhaps better able to forecast the mess than that the UK is likely to be going through. So that's a quite interesting thing in itself. But of course, it will mean lower growth in Europe too. And of course, what happens to the budget? Of course, the budget has already been agreed for up to 2020. Which includes us, of course, and what goes, so it's 1% of GDP, which of course, again, the problem is we pay it every year, but GDP may be falling in some places, so it's still, again, an issue. And the euro itself has not been doing very well, as it happens, overall. And 10% of that goes for all these, goes to aid, and very, very important stuff that is being done. There isn't any expectation of this will be looked at again in the short term. But who knows? And if indeed we do begin to see this sort of collapse in which people have been forecasting in the belief that the EU can survive, then we might actually see all sorts of reverberations. Reverberations will be pretty bad. But there is one important issue, and that is what Mohammed was talking about, which has to do with trade. And indeed, we have seen that world trade has grown very slowly, much more slowly than it should have been the case at this time of the recovery. But a lot of it is due not just to the geopolitical issues and of course the sanctions and everything else, but it's got to do with the lack of finance that's out there. And the Europeans, we're already seeing reverberations in terms of the banking system in Europe. So the thing to worry about more is what happens and the impact on the developing world of that. Plus, of course, the outflows of capital. They had just started going back again in 2016, the beginning of 2016, back into emerging markets after there was huge move out. And that, of course, may well reverse very, very, very quickly.
Maybe, could I ask David and maybe Mohammed as well? The issue is raised. I mean, what does it mean for trade negotiators in Africa or the Commonwealth not to have the UK at the European table?
At the European table, we have not seen much of a difference, quite frankly, given the way that the Doha round has gone at the WTO and so on. We do know that on aid, refugee policy, aid for trade, the enhanced integrated framework, these are programs that the UK has been a very strong supporter of. So from that point of view, I'll be a little bit skeptical as to what the effect will be on the EU, just given the role that we have seen the UK play. But maybe I could just turn this on its head and also say something about what we're learning from Africa on what we are seeing unfolding before us. And this applies not only to Africa, but to other developing contexts as well. The African countries have chosen a regional integration model as the development strategy for obvious reasons, and we find the same sort of model in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, and so on. I think what this has done is that it has shifted the political economy equation from a much more bureaucratic approach, bureaucratic elites making these decisions, and now shifting towards wanting to be much more inclusive in the way that these issues are being approached. Right now, the African countries are negotiating among themselves a free trade agreement. And much of that process has been what we've called Addis Ababa driven, since most of the discussions are taking place in Addis Ababa. But we are now beginning to see a questioning whether that is actually the right approach, and whether there shouldn't be much more interaction with the capitals and so on. So, clearly there is that kind of shift in the sort of political economy dynamics that we're beginning to see.
Okay. Mohammed, do you want to respond on this question about the implications for the EU's role in trade negotiations with Commonwealth countries?
Yeah, I think briefly, all the UK was being part of the European Union. As David has pointed out, we have only seen what Europe or European Commission is doing. But I think on the whole, though, when we do various kind of global advocacy kind of work, we have seen, the UK is really being very close to some of the development aspirations of our member countries. UK is a country that fully understands the challenges faced by, for example, small states. The countries with really small population, island states, with their huge cost of trading. And in many global fora, you will find the UK is actually championing those concerns. Now, the here issue is that is one of the significant fear, that many of the Commonwealth policymakers have now. Now, who is going to, champion those ideas within the European Commission. Someone has referred to the point of aid for trade, where UK has been a lead donor agency. And I think to some extent it's because of the UK's influence as well. We have seen in the whole envelope of ODA, the contribution of aid for trade has been rising. And there is solid evidence that aid for trade in general has impacted positively in many of the developing countries.
Okay, thanks. I've got one question from one of our online viewers, which I'd like Phyllis to take on, if you would, so, which is from Hassana from Morocco, who wants to ask the panel, do you think Brexit might open other opportunities for cooperation and development investments with a particular focus on triangular development cooperation?
I suppose it would depend on the particular country and the sector. I think so much is uncertain at this stage, but I think clearly, maybe Max can chip in on this, where there is a comparative advantage with particular sectors, the UK could look to engage in particular countries outside of the EU when it comes to trade. But I'm not sure which countries those would be at this stage strategically.
Yeah. I think that's what we call a question in pursuit of a silver lining in the very dark cloud.
But there is an issue that we don't have enough trade negotiators here. I mean, everyone's been talking about that now. And having worked for BIS myself, and UKTI was part of us, I think that's probably true right now. I think it was much better before, but so much was being done through the EU that you don't actually need to do that. So, and they're all going to be very busy doing other things, as we know, renegotiating, supposedly, with so many other regions and countries. So try getting finessing things right, which is, I presume, what is being asked here too, may actually escape the ability of the people to do it. So it is a big issue.
Good point. Questions over this side. There's one sort of in the middle over there.
Hi, my name is Shubhajit. I work for Adam Smith International. I have a question quite similar to the online question that came in. So, as an outsider, for an outsider, the EU is a fascinating experiment, liberal economics, but the EU is also sometimes seemingly rigidly protectionist externally. It is very liberal internally, but protectionist externally. So while I understand that this will be a growth depressor, opportunities will go down, how do you respond to, say, some people saying that for non-Europeans, this levels the playing field as far as, say, access to the UK job market is concerned, as far as access to university education seats are concerned? How do you respond to that?
Thank you. Front row.
Hello, Mary Dozhevsky, I write for The Independent and The Guardian. I'd like to ask about remittances. David talked about the prospect of remittances being virtually wiped out. And I wondered what the potential effect was on the receiving countries, but also when you look at the UK, whether it actually stands to help the Brexiteers in reducing the incentives for migration.
Thank you.
Hi, Jack Haldane for Development Finance. A question for the whole panel, really. You mentioned, Mohammed, the UK's influence on the development aspirations of developing countries. What do you all think as to the effect this has had maybe on some of the political aspirations? I mean, what sort of damage has this done in developing countries to the concept of a democracy, where it would sound as though I were making some sort of personal grievance to talk about the damage it has done, except we've heard that maybe a third of Leave voters have tried to EU turn in this respect. Could you maybe comment a little bit on that aspect, the ideological aspect? Thank you.
Let's take the remittances question first, and and I guess this is a huge issue for for the Commonwealth and for Sub-Saharan Africa, because Sub-Saharan Africa already pays by far the highest rates through the money transfer system, around 12% compared to 3% in South Asia. and you've now got this very big foreign exchange hit. I mean, what do you see as some of the longer-term development implications?
For the longer term, I think the African countries are going to do what they've been trying to do, and that is also to look internally to see how to grow their own markets. I think it was Max who mentioned the structural transformation agenda, very clearly to establish various pathways for greater economic resilience. Very clearly, that has to be the direction in sub-Saharan Africa, in Africa as a whole. But I'd like to come back to this question of the triangular cooperation and also the other question relating to what might be the possibilities in regard to education, access to educational services in the UK and so on. And I think one subject we've not explicitly talked about is actually services, where the UK economy is very strong. And although it's difficult to begin to see which countries could be part of a triangular configuration, I can see the possibilities for UK services trade. The UK would need to look more at innovative sources for growth and so on. I think services will be center stage in this, and so we see some possibility there for services trade, the way it could impact on development and so on. So I would put some emphasis on services as well.
Thank you. Mohammed, do you want to take this issue on political, what does it mean for political aspirations in developing countries?
Yeah, before that, Kevin, quickly on the issue of remittances, I think it's an important issue because for many of the developing countries, we have seen, even during the financial crisis, the flows of remittances were resilient, compared to other flows, investment, even aid flows. So it is going to have significant influence on the whole development dimension. Also, think about this way. Within the Commonwealth, just think about the intra-Commonwealth remittance flows from one Commonwealth country to another. For the Caribbean small countries, and we have got 12 members, the flow was $833 million last year, in 2014. So there is a significant number. We're talking about £1 billion dollar going to the Caribbean countries, and this is going to take some time. Also, the other dimension is when we talk about the tourism and think about the composition of tourists, and there are studies that have found that tourists from the UK, on average, they spend 7 times more than tourists on average from other groups of countries. And these are also going to affect significantly, I think, particularly the Caribbean, but also sub-Saharan African countries. So that is the point we need to keep in mind. On the issue of the political aspirations, I think this is a very important question. But I think the way I say this, it has got both other arguments. One was, as you would recall, under the EU GSP and GSP Plus, there were a number of laws and regulations that the European Union wanted the recipient countries to comply with. And that had some negative ramifications. Some of the policymakers in developing countries, they were not quite happy in complying with those requirements that we're all aware of. On the democracy, I cannot make any comment, but the thing that I would like to tell you very sincerely is this. If you look at the literature on regional integration for any of the region, then they give European Union as an example of success. If I'm from South Asia, and even for the South Asia, we have mentioned it quite clearly, saying that currently, intra-South Asia trade is $20 billion. You just follow a European Union model of having closer integration, that trade will go up to $200 billion instantly. So now those countries, they are dismayed by what has happened. So I think it will have some kind of long-run implications as well.
Just on the question of whether it's going to put off people coming because they won't be able to send anything back home. I mean, the interesting thing is that the whole EU thing, if people voted correctly and knew what they were doing, was supposed to be stopping EU immigration. As we know full well that immigration generally, without having realised actually, never mind. As we know, 70% of migration in the last 15 years has been non-EU. And even in the last few years, there have been more non-EU than EU. And that, of course, has been hugely above the government's targets anyway. They didn't do anything to stop that. If that type of migration is affected, then obviously that will reduce the numbers. But we know full well that a number of the people who have been coming under that have been family members after a while. The impact may not be that significant there, but of course you can stop that through all sorts of. And it goes back to the other question about will it be easier for people from elsewhere to come if they still have the aim to reduce the numbers to below to the tens of thousands. Then no, I'm afraid there will be fewer people coming in from outside the EU. So don't raise your hopes too much for whoever it is that may be coming. And actually, frankly, we do need these people, and it would be a great shame.
Phyllis, I wanted to ask you a slightly different question. That if you look at the monetary policy responses from central bank authorities in emerging markets, there are a number of countries which you mentioned, Brazil, South Africa, countries that are either facing political instability or have large current account deficits that will presumably have to make quite significant adjustments. I mean, the future is uncertain, but this turmoil isn't going to stop tomorrow. I just wondered what you see as the longer run development consequences of the types of policy or monetary policy adjustments that central bank authorities might feel pushed into.
Yeah, so not a pretty picture for some countries. Typically, if you see the currency devalued or depreciate by anywhere between 10 and 15%, which we haven't seen in many currencies, admittedly, you get inflation and hyperinflation in many countries. And if you're a country which also has large external imbalances, like a deficit, that tends to be quite an unstable scenario to be in. I have to say, though, that this event, this Brexit, I think it's important to emphasize that, and it was mentioned previously, that it adds a layer of uncertainty to most developing countries right now, because even before this occurred, we had resource economies dealing with a massive terms of trade shock from lower oil and commodity prices, and we had almost all developing countries dealing with a slower China. Which, by the way, is as important or even more important than the UK as a trading partner for a number of developing countries. So this decision, this shock in the UK, really adds that extra layer of uncertainty when it comes to the outlook. But in terms of the currencies, I think that's the key channel to watch out for countries that, number one, have a strong trade relationship with the UK, and number two, countries that just have large external imbalances. They were the ones that really struggled. And that will, as I mentioned, inward investment tends to struggle and tends to suffer in the longer term on the basis of that.
Different to what the UK will be going through. Very high deficit, inward investment, also suffering, and of course costs going up. Just going back to the original question about whether it's going to be something done which will be perhaps improving the lot of the people generally. Actually, consumer prices will be going up. Because of the exchange rate, and already they are. Except, of course, there are price wars in the supermarkets because no one will be able to afford the stuff they're buying. So we seem to be falling into the pattern of the developing country. Yeah.
So there's a question that might have resonance with I'm not going to put this to the panel immediately, but maybe one to reflect on, and I think it'll have resonance for a lot of people in this room, which is from Selina Victor from Mercy Corps, who'd like to ask the panel. How much did the edict of the Charity Commission that NGOs not take a public position affect the result of the referendum? Should we have challenged it? So I'll one for you to mull over. Let's take another set of questions. Front row.
Thanks. Helen Parker from WaterAid. My question, I suppose maybe it follows on nicely from the Mercy Corps question, and it is quite broad, but how can we in the development sector try and brace for these massive negative impacts or try to mitigate their effects? Is it lobbying? Is it our own financial management? Or is it something else?
Okay. One over here.
Yeah, just very quickly to your point about NGOs. I've lived in Ethiopia and I've lived in Zanzibar.
Just say who you are.
Yes, sorry, Orville Kunga, Adinkra Arts Collective. Yes, I was just saying that I've lived in Ethiopia and I've lived and worked in Zanzibar. So NGOs, they're living all right, so I think they're quite happy. But I would just wanted to know, what would you say to my Congolese friend, a refugee, about certainly EU's relationship, certainly when we talk about DRC Congo, and the money that's been poured into the government there as they now go for a third election, regards 300 million, I think, euros, and just, I think it was 60 million towards their government justice reform plan. What would you say to her about EU relationship to certainly DRC Congo? And also, I believe that Sam Akiki wrote recently about, again, EU relationship to Africa in terms of the tariffs, which I think were mentioned as well, quite stiff tariffs, and also the agricultural policy, which was alluded to earlier, as regards obviously the European nations pretty much dumping excesses on African markets. And I just wanted to ask the audience, when's the last time you tasted an African banana, or maybe you've drunk Blue Mountain coffee from Jamaica? So just a couple of points. Thank you.
All right. Are there a couple more questions? Any over this side? Okay. Sorry, who was there? No. Okay, just here. Oh, and then there. Okay.
Hi there, Molly Anders from DevEx. A pretty simple question. I want to know, what is better for aid and trade, a quick or a slow Brexit? Given that a slower Brexit might mean that we retain some of those channels through the EU, is there still some mitigating factors that could actually hurt the markets and aid in general in the longer term?
Okay, so that's a good question. How much do you want this to hurt over what time period?
Hi, Kelly, I'm Director of Policy and Research at Save the Children UK. Just wondering if the panel could comment a little bit on where they would like, if we do Brexit, and I'm hoping there's ways that we can avoid that, but if we do, where they would like the £3 billion we currently spend through European institutions to be reallocated. Can we keep it multilateral on the basis that multilateral aid is in general more effective? What are the options that we should be considering? Thank you.
Okay, so look, there's a broad set of questions there, so I'm going to let you take your pick on what you want to focus on. But actually, that does raise an interesting issue, which is this inevitable? I mean, do you actually think this is now a sealed deal?
Look, I think every person who voted to remain probably hopes not, and that there will be some way around. We may be, most people are probably deluded in thinking that this will happen, but that therefore we can exit it. But who knows? I think politics has become such a difficult one to predict that indeed there may be ways around. Lots of people think that there could be ways around it. There could be another election. There could be another referendum once we know what the deal would be. There could be panic, and who knows? And there may even be a new leader of the Labour Party. So this is completely non-partisan sort of discussion we're having here. Obviously, the referendum's finished, so we don't have to put this down as expenses or campaign expenses. That was one of the questions I think someone asked. And I think that has been an issue, really, the fact that the NGOs haven't had a voice. And we're not just talking about the NGOs. I mean, I know that universities, I mean, the LSE and others would be having sort of one person speaking, and then suddenly they were looked at as if they had actually made a contribution to one campaign or another campaign because they didn't have quite the balance or whatever, which is really silly because we didn't have the right debate. So that would be my response to that. And the response to on whether sooner or later, if given my answer to the first question, which is that Kevin actually asked, and it was raised at the back, which is that we may perhaps not go through it. Prolonging it, I would suggest, is better, even though it may have some uncertainty. The most important thing of it is that, of course, a lot of the commitments we have made, certainly through the EU, remain. What may happen with our own contribution is a different issue, but a lot of the other commitments will remain and will remain for longer. I think that's probably good news.
Okay, maybe just Mohammed and David. You're close to trade negotiators who will be directly affected by this deal, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, as you've set out. I just wonder, in terms of in your own engagement with the UK government on the terms on which it extracts itself from EU institutions. What are the sort of issues that you're going to be raising?
Shall I go first,
Please.
Mohammed? Yeah. No, I think certainly during the transition, whatever transition arrangements, I think should try to lock in the current trading arrangements that are there. So the EPAs which have just been concluded at least give that sort of certainty as to how African countries trade with the EU and the UK would want to see that remains in place. They're not perfect, of course, but nonetheless, that's what we have. The everything but arms is very important for the least developed countries. We would like to see that remain, that those would be taken into account in transitional discussions. So that at least we have certainty. There were one or two intriguing questions, but I don't know if
please go.
Yeah, indeed. Actually, the question about reform in the DR Congo and the support is this is something that we're looking at from another direction, and that is to say that as much as Africa's external economic relations and trade and investment, etc., these are things that we're looking at. But we have also kept our eye on the ball on internal policy reform, reducing trade costs, growing African productivity, diversifying the export production basket, and so on. So these are very important questions that we are very strong advocates for as far as medium to long-term change in Africa is concerned. I don't need to remind you about the figures. Africa only accounts for 1% of world trade. And, you could look at different various sectors where there are huge challenges. So as much as external economic relations does exercise us, but we continue to keep our ball on internal reform. There's also a very quick point on bananas, and they've not been seen or eaten. No, actually, most interestingly, our own research shows that, contrary to what was previously thought, that the reform of the banana regime and indeed the sugar regime would wipe out the production in Africa, but that hasn't happened. Actually, banana and sugar are still doing quite well. So I don't know where you're looking, but you can find some bananas, I'm sure, around. Then just finally, which goes to the first point about what the transitional arrangements are. Certainly for us, we think a slow Brexit would be much more preferable. At least it would give us all a chance to catch our breath, to see what's going on, and to see what sort of policies and strategies. Yeah.
So just to confirm that on bananas, I always get these very small ones from Côte d'Ivoire for my little boy's lunchbox every day. So I think they do seem to be booming. Mohammed.
I think the most important point is about how the world economy is going to, if I can say, ensure stability, when this negotiations takes place. I agree with Vicky. Perhaps prolonged discussion or negotiation could be a good idea. But having said that, what is important to make sure that there is no further repercussions of this sort. Imagine if the euro is also going to have similar kind of impact, the development consequences are going to be much greater. In fact, we are now in a situation when UK, if you think about its share in the global GDP, which is just about 5%, but in terms of the overall impact for development, for developing countries, it's much greater than that. Finally, Kevin, I fully agree with David's point here. Locking in terms of the benefits or current arrangements that African countries have got under EPAs and LDCs under EBA. But although I agree with Vicky and Sheila about the doubts about being hopeful, like how much actually can be achieved, but I think if UK is going to have its own policy mechanism or trade policy regimes for developing countries, it should try to achieve some improvements. And I can be concrete. EBA, I would say, also reform the rules of origin, pretty straightforward. There are examples and that it can do. Second, there is this negotiations on LDC services waiver. WTO members have agreed that can be done, and UK can be a country that can set some example in terms of providing right kind of preferences for the world's poorest countries. Then there is this global deal now. We have got trade facilitation agreement. Of course, we are concerned about UK GDP, overall economic prospect, but I think UK should be committed to advocating for and providing whatever support available in terms of advancing this trade facilitation deal. Thank you.
Thanks. Phyllis, again, I want to ask you a question that didn't come up, but if you look at the patterns of development financing, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa in recent years, there has been quite a significant move into bond markets for infrastructure financing and wider financing. And 3 years ago, the yields were actually pretty low, 2 to 3%. I think last year for some countries, Zambia, Ghana, they were up in the 8 to 9% range. I just wonder what the implications of Brexit might be for bond yields and bond financing in sub-Saharan Africa.
It's such an interesting question because, in fact, global bond yields are declining now because everyone's buying bonds, so the interest rates are coming down. But unfortunately, given this regime of risk aversion, the countries that probably need the finance most will probably pay the highest borrowing costs. So they probably will see some decline in the cost of borrowing, but it won't be a lot. Again, it depends on the country, but it's not a...
Is there any early evidence on this?
Well, there was evidence that the borrowing costs rose in the wake of the vote. But I think in terms of countering shocks and accessing finance, this goes to your question about what can we do to prevent these shocks? I think there's something to be said about emergency finance in these situations of risk aversion. I think, the Bank of England pledged £250 billion to support the UK financial system. Developing countries clearly don't have that luxury when it comes to that type of liquidity. And frankly, I think the G20 should speak up and they should highlight that these types of liquidity arrangements should be made available to non-G20 countries and to less developed countries, to LDCs as well. There's a real lack of foresight when it comes to protecting against these shocks, when it comes to liquidity management. Big gap with what's available in the UK versus developing countries. And borrowing cost definitely feeds into that.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last round, but very brief, if you would, please. Anyone on this side? One right here.
Yes, Helen Jones, Royal Commonwealth Society. I believe that Malta takes up the presidency of the European Community early next year, and I think hands on immediately the baton to the UK as president.
Oh, I think we've already said we're not taking it. I thought.
Oh, have we? Okay.
I thought.
Right, but the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, the next one, is going to be in the UK in the first half of 2018. I wonder if that meeting now becomes incredibly important for us in the development sector to actually more effectively lobby the Commonwealth and key governments in terms of the UK government, in terms of what how we can mitigate some of the impact of Brexit.
Thanks, that's a really good question. One here.
Hi, this is actually a question for you, Kevin, because you were quite vocal about this before the vote, and we spoke, and I got some of your understanding about where you thought this might end us up. But what will this do to the UK's influence on climate change?
Okay. Sheila?
Sorry, a second, but to follow up something which Vicky said, what sort of trade negotiator will the UK be? Because we've all joked about, well, it'll be like some African country negotiating for the first time. But I think the analogy is more with South Africa, which is coming back into trade negotiations after years out of it, with a reasonably educated population, with people who know about trade in theory, but are not trade negotiators. And they, how shall I put this politely, made a mess of their first trade negotiation, and then on the whole got better. But they were very very South African oriented, very much promoting their own interests, very unwilling to compromise when they first started, which is normal for someone who's inexperienced. Is the UK likely to be like that?
Okay, that's a really good sign-off question. So what I'm going to ask you all to do is maybe respond to those two issues that have come up. Actually, one, Mohammed, very relevant to you, I think, on the Commonwealth. I'll try and say something about climate change after, but and also on, you know, the UK's capabilities and what it'll bring to the trade negotiator table. So, and if you make your own sign-off comments as well. Let's go from left to right.
Thank you. Yes, our members, you know, they are already concerned. We over the past week or so, we have received a number of queries. You know, they're asking for information. We are deeply engaged with them, and in my view, we also think that, you know, the next CHOGM is going to be a CHOGM where the Commonwealth countries, they need to also come closer and reflect on what has happened in the war. We work closely, especially on the global advocacy side. And the next CHOGM will be an important opportunity for us to think about the right course of action and perhaps a bit more, you know, I would say solid and committed engagement from the UK government and other governments alike, you know, so that, you know, we can all address these serious concerns, particularly the issues on development side. With regards to the UK's trade negotiating capacity, Sheila, I'm perhaps a bit more hopeful than the way you have articulated it. I think, as you know, the trade negotiation, it takes time. And that time itself gives a lot of capacity building opportunities. We just need to be, I mean, in the UK, I mean, they just need to be, I would say, innovative. And sometimes, you know, some of the policies, you know, thinking of other negotiators who can help, that will be extremely helpful. It's a bit irony that, you know, the UK aid, especially under Aid for Trade, has gone to many of our developing countries in helping them with trade negotiations. There is a flagship Commonwealth project on what we call hub and spokes, you know, and under that particular project, we have got about 30 advisors, you know, who are working with many developing country governments, you know, advising them on trade policy issues. So one thing is, of course, that time will be important, and I think we'll see, you know, that capacity is being developed here. So I'm slightly hopeful. It's all about, you know, how that process can be managed. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think that's a very, very good point that Mohammed just made, that obviously there are people all around. In fact, there are probably lots of people in this room who can offer their services because they know the issues in very many countries. But of course, that could be, and if we have a point system, we could bring lots of South Africans over to assist us, because they would be the sort of needed expertise that we need in the UK. So we could put them at the top of the list. So, but I do want, first of all, I say that I thought that we were not, that the UK had actually given up running. I read this somewhere. It may not be true. The fact that no one else seems to know this worries me. So I'm probably wrong. So it's worth checking. But I think it's a huge potential. But the interesting thing would be to what extent, of course, the UK can still hold its own, if you like, and really influence things. And I think we'll be weakened in those discussions, and that's a real problem. But I think one of the things that's just been raised on the trade side, which we perhaps didn't touch on, even though someone asked it and made the point, is the soft power that we exercise. My experience of having done a lot of developing country work is that the expertise we give, the technical assistance we provide, the support with ministries and so on, the putting people in various economic areas, the ODI fellows and all that sort of stuff, is quite extraordinary, and I think considerably better received in various countries than is the case with others. And I think we will be losing that if for any reason that is reduced. And it is really the technical assistance that matters a lot in terms of getting people to really rethink the way in which they run their economy. And we would be losing that because, of course, we want them then to be proper partners to deal with and trade with. And so we need to absolutely not have the problems of corruption and all this sort of stuff that is still out there, and having our people worried about and concerned about these issues is really important. And having said that, of course, being an economist, I would always find that the social scientists sort of completely disagreeing with any of our free market policies, which I discovered all around, including, of course, having worked in Zanzibar, which was mentioned before. So there's still there are tensions, but they are, I think, quite healthy tensions, and we manage them considerably better, I think, than many of the other agencies.
David.
Yeah, well, the South Africans haven't changed that much, I can say. I've watched them in 2 sessions of the Trade Negotiating Forum for the CFTA, and by all accounts, also in the tripartite free trade area negotiations, they've been very hard-nosed and uncompromising and not quite understanding what other partners want from a deal and so on. So, yeah, I mean, South Africa could be a good source of expertise. But actually, I know that Vicky has worked in the Department of Business and Skills, so she would know more. But my sense is that the challenge for the UK is not really on the negotiation side, would be my own view. That the resources in this country on the trade negotiation side, including even in the city, where the trade law practices that we know are advising governments around the world on trade negotiations. So to me, I don't think that's where the capacity deficit is. I think the capacity deficit, rather, is in trade administration. The UK doesn't have the equivalent of, say, the International Trade Commission, which the US has for investigating contingency trade related issues, anti-dumping and so on. Or I think the research capacity also in the UK is sort of scattered all over the place. It doesn't come together as it does in the US or in other countries, in Canada and so on. So I think it's really the trade administration part that's going to be the challenge, not so much in the negotiations. By the way, several of the best textbooks that I know and I recommend on trade negotiations are written here, including by my good friend Sheila, sitting right there. So that's not where I think the issue is. But my last point would be this. And that is, I think this is the time for progressive voices. I think someone was asking the question, how to mitigate the effects. I think this is the time for progressive voices. This is the time for honest people to speak up. And we've seen in cases where the progressive voice has been muted, the loss of influence, the loss of progress on these issues. So I think this sort of activity is great. I hope ODI and others would continue to do this, bring people together to think through these things and to ensure that there is a strong advocacy. I was saying before that we came into this discussion that when Canada lost the North-South Institute, which had been a very strong advocate and independent think tank on these issues, we see the effect that had on Canadian trade and aid policy. So I'd hope that this doesn't happen in this country and that would hear the progressive voices really speak out and challenge the questions as they go forward.
Thanks, David.
Yep. I mean, looking ahead, I think the key challenge is mitigating the inherent uncertainty involved with these types of trade negotiations and to safeguard growth. I tend to take a different view that I think that a speedier start to the negotiations would mitigate the economic uncertainty, certainly in the markets, which is going to have the spillover effect on growth. But I think we're managing a very difficult period ahead, and I agree that we need progressive voices to be at the forefront of that.
Thank you. Actually, I think what I'm supposed to do at this point of the evening is to summarise the discussion, but you can forget that. I'm not going to. I think we've had an incredibly rich discussion. But I do want to make, if I could, just 4 or 5 really brief points on how we got here and how we need to get to a better place. Just reflecting back on the referendum, you have to say that was one hell of a way not to run a campaign. Because the strategy on the Brexit side was to dump a dead cat on the table and say this costs your economy, whatever the number was, £20 billion a year. And we're going to talk about the dead cat. And then the debate was it doesn't cost 20 billion, it costs 8 billion. And by the way, your house price might go down and you might lose 1% of growth. So you've got one side appealing to the heart, it's patriotism and sovereignty and talking about the dead cat, and the other side asking the IMF to come up with a number on the macroeconomic, and the political disconnect. I think it was evident really early on this was going in a really bad direction, and a very winnable campaign was lost in part because of the narrative. And actually, I have to say, reading Peter Mandelson in the Financial Times last weekend, half recognises it, but doesn't fully get it. And I do think there are really important lessons for us. That these narratives on development and interdependence really matter a lot. And on that theme, there's very little that Michael Gove said during the campaign that was true. But one of the things he did say that was right was that globalization has benefited the rich in Britain and left the rest of the country behind. Very few people in the Labour Party were heard publicly voicing that particular view. But I do think if you look at those voting patterns, that there was this very sharp distinction between the rich and the poor. When you get Stoke-on-Trent vote, one of the most deprived parts of the country, some of the most deprived parts of Cornwall that are getting the biggest per capita transfers from the EU, voting the same way as Buckinghamshire, and the richest 10% of the country. It really tells you something very fundamental about what's going on with inequality in the UK. And I think this mixture of the rise of in-work poverty, the collapse of decent quality services, and this really deep sense of alienation, which I think clearly escaped the attention of the political elite, if we're honest about it. David, you mentioned the need for progressive narratives, and I don't think this is a straight left-right issue, but I think it is the case that we lost sight of the importance of domestic political and social and economic developments for how people view Britain's place in the world and Britain's place in Europe, and we're paying a really high price for that. The third point I wanted to make is that Vicky, you said right at the beginning, and I think it's right, that you can look at the economic consequences and the transmission mechanisms, but there are really deep political undercurrents that are at play here as well. And many of the people, the think tanks who felt far less constrained by the Charity Commission than some of the NGOs, the newspaper editors that were pushing in a Brexit direction, do have a particular view about Britain's place in the world, and it is a very insular view, and it's profoundly anti-aid. And if these, or the anti-aid bit is a part of the story. It's about governments are bad. Governments that give a lot of money in aid to other governments are doubly bad. And I think it's an absolute certainty that there are knives being sharpened on the aid budget. And I don't think it's inevitable that it goes in that direction, but unless we can create a really compelling narrative around Britain's place in the world and the place of aid in explaining Britain's place in the world, I do think we're heading in a bad direction, both on aid and on development cooperation more broadly. And I agree with the speakers that I think, and Sheena made this point very strongly as well, that the withdrawal of UK influence in Europe, if you just think of climate change, I mean, less of a voice for the UK means more of a voice for Poland, actually, if you put it very crudely. And more of a voice for Poland in shaping EU climate policy is not a good thing for developing countries. So, I do think reasserting that case and winning those arguments is absolutely critical. One of the things I found really helpful from the speakers, but also from the questions, that coming into ODI the day after the vote was a bit like wandering around the local morgue. And I think we're still sort of coming out of that, to be completely honest with you. Look at the faces around the room. No, I'm joking. But I do think we have to start getting into the mindset of, we're not helpless in the face of this, and not everything is fixed in stone. And, you've all set out very practical agendas that can be advanced, on rules of origin, on making the case for everything but arms. I would say on remittances, given the foreign exchange shock, there's a sustainable development goal target of getting remittance transfer costs down to 3%. I mean, that target is way too high, in my view, but for Africa, it's now currently 12%. So actually, you could counteract a large part of the foreign exchange effect by driving our remittances costs. Now, this is a regulatory issue. I mean, these guys are operating a cartel. And, for free marketeers who don't like cartels, I think, making the case for Western Union and others to do what they should have done years ago and be more competitive, and African governments as well, actually, to allow more competitive markets develop. So, and I think this is something we should come together on. We've got Sheila, who's one of the great experts on international trade. The expertise around this table. I mean, this has to be a point where we come together to frame the type of agenda that we can take to the Commonwealth Summit and elsewhere that could really make a difference. The last thing, which I'm not going to go into any sort of detail, but one thing that worries me a lot about the vote and the debate surrounding it was the narrative around migration, which is actually a code for how we think about others and our international responsibilities, and the generalized collapse of empathy, actually. And, it's a tough debate to take up, but I think, and there was clearly a deeply nasty undercurrent in relation to migration on the part of the Leave campaign, but it wasn't universal, actually. And I do think we have to reassert the right of migrant people and refugees to a fair deal in Europe and in the UK, and the UK should be doing a lot more on that. So the first thing I was supposed to do was to sum up, which I've comprehensively failed to do that. The second thing I have to do is thank the audience. So huge thank you. I think that was a fantastic debate that we had. So thank you to all of you for the questions and the contributions. The third thing I have to do is thank the speakers, which is an absolute pleasure to do that. Phyllis, David, Vicky, and Mohammed. Thank you so much to all of you for... And the fourth thing I have to say is to say that you're all invited to stay on for what is probably EU wine, but to be taken in what is now a sovereign, free nation. So thank you so much to all of you.